Volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, Psychology and Religion, West and East. We're in the third book, I believe. Transformation, Symbolism in the Mass. This was published in 1942 and again in 1954. We are on chapter 3. Parallels to the Transformation Mystery. This is section 1. The Aztec Teocuelo. Although the Mass itself is a unique phenomenon in the history of comparative religion, its symbolic content would be profoundly alien to man were it not rooted in the human psyche. But if it's so rooted, then we may expect to find similar patterns of symbolism, both in the earlier history of mankind and in the world of pagan thought contemporary with it. As the prayer supra quae shows, the liturgy of the Mass contains allusions to the prefigurations in the Old Testament, and thus indirectly to an ancient sacrificial symbolism. In general, it is clear then that in Christ's sacrifice and the communion, one of the deepest chords in the human psyche is struck. Human sacrifice and ritual, anthropophagy. Unfortunately, I cannot enter into the wealth of ethnological material in question here, so must content myself with mentioning the ritual slaying of the king to promote the fertility of the land, the prosperity of his people, the renewal and revivification of the gods through human sacrifice, and the total meal and purpose of which was to reunite the participants with life of their ancestors. These hints will suffice to show how the symbols of the Mass penetrate into the deepest layers of the psyche and its history. They are evidently among the most ancient and most central of religious conceptions. Now, with regard to these conceptions, there is still a widespread prejudice, not only among laymen, but in scientific circles too, that beliefs and customs of this kind must have been invented at some time or other, and were then handed down and imitated so that they would not exist at all in the most places. Unless they had got there in the manner suggested, it is, however, always precarious to draw conclusions from our modern civilized mentality about the primitive state of mind. Primitive consciousness differs from that of the present day white man in several very important respects. Thus, in primitive societies, inventing is very different from what it is with us, where one novelty follows another. With primitives, life goes on in the same way for generations. Nothing alters, except perhaps the language. That does not mean that a new one is invented. Their language is alive and can therefore change, a fact that has been an unpleasant discovery for many lexicographers of primitive languages. Similarly, no one invents the picturesque slang spoken in America. Just springs up in inexhaustible abundance from the fertile soil of colloquial speech. Religious rites and their stock of symbols must have developed in much the same way from the beginnings now lost to us, and not just in one place only, but in many places at once, and also at different periods. They have grown spontaneously out of the basic conditions of human nature, which are never invented but are everywhere the same. So it is not surprising that we find religious rites which come very close to Christian practices in a field untouched by classical culture. I mean, the rites of the Aztecs, and in particular that of the Teocuelo, god eating, as recorded by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, who began his missionary work among the Aztecs in 1529, 8 years after the conquest of Mexico. In this rite, a dough-like paste was made out of crushed and pounded seeds of the prickly poppy and molded into the figure of god Huitzilopochtli. And upon the next day, the body of Huitzilopochtli died, and he who slew him was a priest known as Quetzalcoatl, and that with which he slew him was a dart pointed with flint, which he shot into his heart. He died in the presence of Moctezuma, and the keeper of the god, who verily spoke to Huitzilopochtli, who verily appeared before him, who indeed could make him offerings, and of 4 masters of the use, front rank leaders, before all of them died. Huitzilopochtli, and when he died, thereupon they broke up his body of dough. His heart was a portion to Moctezuma, and as for the rest of his members, which were made as it were to be his bones, they were distributed and divided up among all. Each year they ate it. And when they divided up amongst themselves his body made of dough, it was broken up, exceeding small, very fine, as small as seeds. The youths ate it, and of this which they ate it was said, the god has eaten. Of those who ate it, it was said, they guard the god. The idea of divine body as sacrifice is the presence of the high priest to whom the god appears, with whom he speaks. The piercing with the spear and the god's death followed by ritual dismemberment and the eating, communio, of a small piece of his body are all parallels which cannot be overlooked and which caused much consternation among the worthy Spanish fathers at the time. In Mithraism, a religion that sprang up not long before Christianity, we find a special set of sacrificial symbols, and it would seem a corresponding ritual which unfortunately is known to us only from dumb monuments. There is a transistus with Mithras carrying the bull sacrifice for seasonal fertility, a stereotyped representation of the sacrificial act flanked on either side by dadoffers carrying raised and lowered torches, and the meal at which pieces of bread marked with crosses were laid at the table. Even small bells have been found, and these probably have some connection with the bell, which is sounded at Mass. The Mithraic sacrifice is essentially a self-sacrifice, since the bull was a world bull and was originally identical with Mithras himself. This may account for the singularly agonized expression on the face of the Pterocotonus, which bears comparison with Guido Reni's crucifixion. The Mithraic transistus is a motif that corresponds to Christ carrying the cross, just as the transformation of the beast of sacrifice corresponds to the resurrection of the Christian God in the form of food and drink. The representations of the sacrificial act, the Pterocotonus bull slaying, recall the crucifixion between 2 thieves, one of whom is raised up to paradise, while the other goes down to hell. These few references to the Mithras cult are but one example of the wealth of parallels offered by legends and rites of the various Near Eastern gods who die young, are mourned and rise again. For anyone who knows these religions at all, there can be no doubt as to the basic affinity of the symbolic types and ideas at the time of primitive Christianity and in the early days of the Church. The pagan world was saturated with conceptions of this kind and with philosophical speculations based upon them. And it was against this background that the thought and visionary ideas of the Gnostic philosophers were unfolded. Section 2, Chapter 3. Excuse me, I just want to make sure I'm correct that it is Chapter 3. Yep. Section 2 of Chapter 3. The vision of Zosimos. A characteristic representative of the school of thought was Zosimos of Panopolis, a natural philosopher and alchemist of 3rd century AD, whose works have been preserved through incorrupt state, and famous alchemical Codex Marcianus were published in 1887 by Berthelot in his collections De Anciens Alchemis Grecs. In various portions of his treatise, Zosimos relates a number of dream visions, all of which appear to go back to one and the same dream. He was clearly a non-Christian Gnostic, and in particular, so one gathers from the famous passage about the crater, an adherent of the Poimandres sect and therefore a follower of Hermes. Although alchemical literature abounds in parables, I would hesitate to class these dream visions among them. Anyone acquainted with the language of alchemists would recognize that their parables are more allegories of ideas that were common knowledge, and the allegorical figures and actions one can usually see at once what substances and what procedures are being referred to under a deliberately theatrical disguise. There is nothing of this kind in the Zosimos visions. Indeed, it comes almost as a surprise to find the alchemical interpretation, namely, that the dream and its impressive machinery and simply an illustration of the means for producing the divine water. Moreover, a parable is a self-contained whole, whereas our vision varies and amplifies a single theme, as the dream does. So far as one can assess the nature of these visions at all, I should say that even in the original text, the contents of an imaginative meditation have grouped themselves around the kernel of an actual dream and been woven into it. That there really was such a meditation is evidence from fragments of that accompany the visions, the form of commentary. As we know, meditations of this kind are often vividly pictorial, as if the dream were being continued on a level nearer to a consciousness. In the lexicon, Alchemy, Martian Rouland, writing in Frankfurt in 1612, defines the meditation that plays such an important part in alchemy as an internal colloquy with someone else, who is nevertheless not seen, maybe with God, with oneself, or with one's good angel. The latter is a milder and less obnoxious form of the Paradros, the familiar spirit of ancient alchemy, who was generally a planetary demon conjured, nevertheless not seen maybe with God, with oneself, or with one's good angel. The latter is a milder and less obnoxious form of Paradros, the familiar spirit of ancient alchemy, who was generally a planetary demon conjured up by magic. It can hardly be doubted that real visionary experiences originally lay at the root of these practices. And a vision is, in the last resort, nothing less than a dream, which has broken through into the waking state. We know from numerous witnesses all through the ages, the alchemists in this course his imaginative work was beset by visions of all kinds, and was sometimes even threatened with madness. So the visions of Zosimos are not something unusual or unknown in alchemical experiences, though they are perhaps the most important self-revelations ever bequeathed to us by an alchemist. I cannot reproduce here the text of the visions in full, but we'll give as an example the first vision in Zosimos' own words. And while I said this, I fell asleep, and I saw a sacrificial priest standing before me, high up on the altar, which was in the shape of a shallow bowl. There were 15 steps leading up to the altar, and the priest stood there. I heard a voice from above say to me, "Behold, I have completed the descent down the 15 steps of darkness, and I have completed the ascent up the steps of light, and he who renews me is a priest, casting the grossness of the body. And by compelling necessity, I am sanctified, and now stand in perfection as a spirit, Numia. I perceived the voice of him who stood upon the altar, and I inquired of him who he was. And he answered me in a fine voice, saying, I am Eon, priest of the innermost hidden sanctuary, and I submit myself to an unendurable torment, for there came one in haste at early morning who overpowered me and pierced through with a sword and cut me in pieces. yet in such a way that the order of my limbs was preserved, and he drew off the scalp of my head with the sword, which he wielded with strength. And he put the bones and the pieces of flesh together, and with his own hand burned them in the fire, until I perceived that I was transformed and had become spirit, and that is my unendurable torment. And even as he spoke this, I held him by force to converse with me. His eyes became as blood, and he spewed out all of his own flesh. And I saw how he changed into a mannequin who lost part of himself. He tore his flesh with his own teeth and sank into himself. In the course of the visions, the Hieros priests appears in various forms. At first, he is split into figures of the Hieros and the Hierogen sacrificer. Here Orgon, who is charged with the performance of the sacrifice. But these figures blend into one in so far as both suffer the same fate. The sacrificial priest submits voluntarily to the torture by which he is transformed, but he is also the sacrificer who is sacrificed, since he is pierced through with the sword and ritually dismembered. The Dipnon consists in his tearing himself to pieces with his own teeth and eating himself, the Thesia, his flesh being sacrificially burned on the altar. He is a Hieros, so far as he rules over the sacrificial rite as a whole, and over the human beings who are transformed during the Thesia. He calls himself a guardian of spirits. It is also known as the Brazen Man, and as Zerogos, the Barber. The Brazen or Leaden Man is an allusion to the spirits of the metals, or planetary demons, as protagonists of the sacrificial drama. In all probability, they are Midori, who were conjured up by magic, as may be deduced from Zosmos' remark that he held him by force to converse with him. The planetary demons are none other than the old gods of Olympus who finally expired. Only in the 18th century, as the souls of the metals, or rather, assumed a new shape, since it was in this same century that paganism openly arose for the first time in the French Revolution. Somewhat more curious in the term barber, which we find in other parts of the visions, for there is no mention of cutting the hair or shaving. There is, however, a scalping, which in our context is closely connected with the ancient rites of flaying and their magical significance. I need hardly mention the flaying of Marsyas, who is an unmistakable parallel to the sun lover of Sibyl, namely Attis, the dying god, who rises again. In one of the old Attic fertility rites, an ox was flayed, stuffed, set up on his feet. Herodotus reports a number of flaying ceremonies among the Scythians, and especially scalpings in general. Flaying signifies transformation from a worse state to a better, and hence renewal and rebirth. The best examples are to be found in the religion of ancient Mexico. Thus, in order to renew the moon goddess, a young woman was decapitated and skinned, and the youth then put the skin around him to represent the rising goddess. The prototype of this renewal is a snake casting its skin every year, phenomenon round which primitive fantasy has always played in our vision. The skinning is restricted to the head, and this can probably be explained by the underlying idea of spiritual transformation. Hence, olden times, shaving the head has been associated with consecration, that is, with spiritual transformation or initiation. The priests of Isis had their heads shaved quite bald, and the tonsure, as we know, is still in use at the present day. The system of transformation goes back to the old idea. The transformed one becomes like a newborn babe, neophyte, with a hairless head. In the myth of the night sea journey, The hero loses all of his hair during his incubation in the belly of the monster because of the terrific heat. The custom of tonsure, which is derived from these primitive ideas, naturally presupposes the presence of a ritual barber. Curiously enough, we come across a barber in that old alchemical mystery, The Chemical Wedding of 1616. There the hero, on entering the mysterious castle, is pronounced on by invisible barbers who give him something very like a tonsure. Here again, the initiation and transformation process is accompanied by a shaving. In one variant of these visions, there is a dragon who is killed and sacrificed in the same manner as a priest, and therefore seems to be identical with him. This makes one think of those far from uncommon medieval pictures, not necessarily alchemical, which the serpent is shown hanging on the cross in place of Christ, psychology and alchemy. Note the comparison of Christ with the serpent of Moses in John 3:14. A notable aspect of the priest is the leaden homunculus, and this is none other than the leaden spirit of planetary demon, Saturn. Zosimos de Saturn was regarded as a Hebrew god. Presumably, on account of keeping holy of the Sabbath, Saturday means Saturn's day. And also on account of the Gnostic parallel with the Supreme Archon, Io Vara, child of chaos, who as may be grouped together with Baal, Kronos, and Saturn. The later Arabic designation of Zosimos does not, of course, prove that he himself was a Jew, but it is clear from his writings that he was acquainted with the Jewish tradition. The parallel between the Hebrew god and the Saturn is of considerable importance as regards the alchemical idea of the transformation of the god of the Old Testament into the god of the New. The alchemists naturally attached great significance to Saturn, for besides being the utmost planet, the supreme archon, the Heronites named him Primus, and the demiurge Isla de Boeth, he was also the spirituous nigger who lies captive in the darkness of matter. The deity, or the part of the deity, which has been swallowed up in his own creation. He is the dark god who reverts to his original luminous state in the mystery of alchemical transmutation. As the Aurora Consurgens says, "Blessed is he that shall find the science, and into whom this prudence of Saturn floweth." Later alchemists were familiar not only with the ritual slaying of a dragon, but also with the slaying of a lion, which took the form of his having all four paws cut off. Like the dragon, the lion devours himself, and so is probably only a variant. The vision itself indicates that the main purpose of the transformation process is the spiritualization of sacrificing priests. He is to be changed into Numia. We are also told that he would change the bodies into blood, make the eyes to see, and the dead to rise again. Later in the visions, he appears in glorified form, shining white like midday sun. Throughout the visions, it is clear that sacrificer and sacrificed are one and the same. This idea of the unity of the prima and ultima materia, of that which redeems and that which is to be redeemed, pervades the whole of alchemy from beginning to end. Unus est lapis, una medicina, unus ves, unum regimen, unic despacito is a key formula to its enigmatic language. Greek alchemy expresses the same idea in the formula. Its symbol is a Ouroboros, the tail-eating serpent in our vision. It is a priest as sacrificer who devours himself as a sacrifice. This recalls the saying of St. John Chrysostom that in the Eucharist, Christ drinks his own blood. By the same token, one might add, he eats his own flesh. The grisly repast in the dream of Zosmosis reminds us that the orgiastic meals in the Dionysus cult, when sacrificial animals were torn to pieces and eaten, they represent Dionysus Tigrisus, being torn to pieces by the Titans, from whose mangled remains arises. Zosimos tells us that the vision represents or explains the production of the waters. The visions themselves only show the transformation into nomia in the language of the alchemist. However, spirits and water are synonymous as they are in the language of the early Christians for whom water meant spiritus, veritatis. In the book of Crates, we read, you make the bodies to liquefy so that they mingle and become an homogeneous liquid. This is the name, the divine water. The passage corresponds to the Zosimos text, which says, the priest would change the bodies into blood. For the alchemists, water and blood are identical. This transformation is the same as solutio or liquefacto, which is a synonym for simplimatio for water, is also fire. Adem ignis est equa et ignis noster, est ignis et non ignis for fire is water, nor fire is a fire that is no fire. Aqua nostra is said to be the secret of our philosophy, is said to be our mystical water, and the permanent water is the fiery form of the true water. Permanent water also signifies spiritualis sanguis and is identified with the blood and water that flowed from Christ's side. Heinrich Conrad says of this water, so there will open for thee a healing flood which issues from the heart of the sun. Of the great world it is a water, which the son of the great world pours forth from his body, and a heart to be for us a true and natural aqua vitae, just as spiritual water of grace and truth plows from Christ's sacrifice, so the divine water is produced by a sacrificial act of Zosimos vision. It is mentioned in the ancient treatise entitled Isis to Horus, where the angel Emniel brings it to the prophetess in a drinking vessel. As Zosimos was probably an adherent of the Pomendaris sect, another thing to be considered here is the crater which God filled with nous for all those seeking. But nous is identical with the alchemical Mercurius. That is quite clear from the Austenus quotation in Zosimos, which says, go to the streams of the Nile, and there thou wilt find a stone which hath a spirit. Take it and divide it, thrust in thy hand, and draw out its heart, for its soul is in its heart. Commenting on this, Zosimos remarks that having a spirit is a metaphorical expression for the exodragerosis, the expulsion of the quicksilver. During the first centuries after Christ, the words nous and moia were used indiscriminately, and the one could easily stand for the other. Moreover, the relation of Mercurius, the spirit, is an extreme ancient astrological fact. Like Hermes, Mercurius, or the planetary spirit Mercury, was a god of revelation who discloses the sect of the art of the adepts. The Liber Quadrantarium, which being of Heronite origin cannot be dated later than the 10th century, says of Mercurius, Eps inum eperit classinus operum cum ingeno et intellectu su, for he opens with his genius and understanding the locked, insoluble problems of the work. He is also the soul of the bodies, and Mia Vitalis and Rulin defines him as spirit, which has become earth. He is a spirit that penetrates into the depths of the material world and transforms it like the nous. He is symbolized by the serpent In Michael Mayer, he points the way to the earthly paradise besides being identified with Hermes. Trismegistus is also called mediator, and the original man, the hermaphroditic Adam. From numerous passages, it is clear that Mercerus is as much a fire as a water, both which aptly characterize the spirit or the nature of spirit. Killing with the sword is a recurrent theme in alchemical literature. The philosophical egg is divided with the sword, and with it the king is transfixed, and the dragon or corpus dismembered, the latter being represented as the body of man whose head and limbs were cut off. The lion's paws are likewise cut off with the sword, for the alchemical sword brings about the salutio or separatio of the elements, thereby restoring the original condition of chaos, so that a new and more perfect body can be produced by a new impressio forme, or by a new imagination. The sword is therefore that which kills and vivifies. The same is said of the permanent water, or mercurial water. Mercurius is the giver of life, as well as the destroyer of the old form. In excelestial symbolism, the sword, which comes out of the mouth of the Son of Man in the book of Revelation, is, according to Hebrews 4:12, the Logos, the Word of God, and hence Christ himself. This analogy did not escape the notice of the alchemists, who are always struggling to give expression to their fantasies. Mercurius was their mediator and savior, their Philis macrocosmi, contrasted with Christ, the Philis macrocosmi, solver and separator. So he too is a sword, for he is a penetrating spirit, more piercing than a two-edged sword. Gerhard Dorn, an alchemist of the 16th century, says that in our world the sword was changed into Christ, our Savior. He comments as follows. After a long interval of time, the Deus Optimus Maximus immersed himself in the innermost of his secrets, and he decided, out of the compassion of his love, as well as for the demands of justice, to take the sword of wrath from the hand of the angel, and having hung the sword on the tree, he substituted it for a golden trident, and thus was the wrath of God changed into love. When peace and justice were united, the water of grace flowed more abundantly from above, and now it bathes the whole world. This passage, which might have occurred, is that a passage, or is that just sick? I want to read this. After man's first disobedience, the Lord straightened the wide road into a very narrow and difficult path as you see it. Its entrance he placed an angel of cherubim holding in his hand a double-edged sword, with which he was to keep all from entering into paradise, turning from thence on account of the sin of their first parents. The sons of Adam built for themselves a broad left hand path. This you have shunned after a long interval of time. Deus Optimus Maximus immersed himself in the innermost of his secrets, and he decided, out of the compassion of his love, as well as for the demands of justice, to take the sword of wrath from the hand of the angel. And having hung the sword on the tree, he substituted it for a golden trident, and thus was the wrath of God changed into love, and justice remained unimpaired. Previous to this, however, the river was not collected into one, as it is now, but before the fall it was spread equally over the whole world, like dew, but later it returned to the place of its origin. When peace and justice were united, the water of grace flowed more abundantly from above. Now it bathes the whole world. Some of those who take the left hand, a path on seeing the sword suspended from the tree, and knowing this history, pass it by because they are too entangled in the affairs of the world. Someone saying it, do not choose to inquire into its efficacy. Others never see it and would not wish to see it. All these continue pilgrimages into the valley, except for those who are drawn back to Mount Zion by the hook of repentance. Now in our age, which is an age of grace. The sword has become Christ our Savior, who ascended the tree of the cross for our sins. Philosophical tree. So I'm just looking up how many more fucking pages until next chapter, because I'm getting a little sleepy and I don't think I have anything else to drink next to me. I'll have a little bit left. This passage, which might well have occurred in an author like Rabanus, Morris, or Honorius of Audun, without doing them discredit, actually occurs in context, which throws a light on certain esoteric alchemical doctrines, namely in a colloquy between anima, and corpus. There we are told that it is Sophia and Sapientia, or Philosophia of the alchemist, de cru fonte scetunt aquae, from whose fount the waters gush forth. This wisdom is the nous that lies hidden and bound in matter. The serpens miraculous, or the humidium ridicale, that manifests itself in the viventis aquae fluvis de montes apais, stream of the living water from the summit of the mountain. That is the water of grace, the permanent and divine water which now bathes the whole world. The apparent transformation of the God of the Old Testament into the God of the New is in reality the transformation of the Deus Auskidius into the Medicina Catholica of alchemical wisdom. The divisive and separative function of the sword, which is of such importance in alchemy, is prefigured in the flaming sword. The angel that separated our first parents from paradise. Separation by a sword is a theme that can also be found in the Gnosis of the Ophites. The earthly cosmos is surrounded by a ring of fire, which at the same time encloses paradise. But paradise and the ring of fire are separated by a flaming sword. An important interpretation of the flaming sword is given in Simon Magus. There is an incurable essence potentially present in every human being, the divine Numia, which is stationed above and below in the stream of water. Simon says, this Numia, I and thou before me, I who am after thee, it is a force that generates itself, that causes itself to grow. It is its own mother, sister, bride, daughter, its own son, mother, father, unity, a root of the whole. It is the very ground of existence, the procreative urge, which is of fiery origin. Fire is related to blood, which is fashioned warm and ruddy like fire. Blood turns into semen in men, and in women into milk. This turning is interpreted as the flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. The operative principle in semen and milk turns into mother and father. The tree of life is guarded by the turning, i.e. transforming sword, and this is the seventh power, which begets itself. For if the flaming sword turned not, then would that fair tree be destroyed and perish utterly. But if it turneth into semen and milk, and there be added the Logos, and the place of the Lord where the Logos is begotten, he who dwelleth potentially in the semen and milk shall grow to full stature from the littlest spark, and shall increase and become a power boundless and immutable, like unchanging aeon, which suffereth no more change until measureless eternity. It is clear from these remarkable statements of Hippolytus concerning the teachings of Simon Magus that the divine sword is very much more than an instrument which divides it is itself the force which turns from something infinitesimally small into the infinitely great, from water, fire, and blood, and becomes a limitless eon, which is meant. What it means is the transformation of the vital spirit in man into the divine. The natural being becomes the divine pneumia, as in the visions of Zosimos, Simon's description of the creative pneumia. The true Ukraine substance corresponds in every detail to the Ouroboros or serpents mercurialis of the Latinists. It too is its own father, mother, son, daughter, brother, and sister from the earliest beginnings of alchemy, right down to the end. It begets and sacrifices itself, and is its own instrument of sacrifice, for it is a symbol of the deadly and life-giving water. Simon's ideas also throw significant light on the above-quoted passage from Dorn. The sword of wrath is transformed into Christ, where it not the philosophomonia of Hippolytus were first discovered in the 19th century. On Mount Athos, one might almost suppose that Dorn had made use of them. There are numerous other symbols in alchemy whose origin is so doubtful that one does not know whether to attribute them to tradition or to a study of the heresiologists or to the spontaneous revival. The sword as the proper instrument of sacrifice occurs again in the old treatise entitled Consilium Conjugii de Massaluis et Luni, that says both must be killed with their own sword, both referring to Sol and Luna. In the still older Tractus Mauritius, dating perhaps from the 12th century, we find the fiery sword. In quotation from the Asens, the great Ostanes said, take an egg, pierce it with the fiery sword, and separate its soul from its body. Here the sword is something that divides body and soul, corresponding to the division between heaven and earth. The ring of fire in paradise and the first parents in an equally old treaty, the allegory Sapientum Supra Librum Turbe. There is even mention of a sacrificial rite. Take a fowl, volatile, cut off its head with a fiery sword, then pluck out its feathers, separate the limbs, and cook over a charcoal fire till it becomes of one color. Hence we have a decapitation with fiery sword when a clipping, or more accurately a plucking, and finally a cooking the cock, which is probably what is meant here, is simply called volatile, a foul or winged creature, and this is a common term for spirits. The spirit still nature-bound and imperfect and in need of improvement in another old treaty with the very similar title, Allegory Superlibrium Turbe. We find the following supplementary variants: kill the mother, tearing off the hands and feet, take a viper, cut off its head and tail, take a cock and pluck it alive, take a man, shave him and drag him over the stone, i.e. dry him on the hot stone, till his body dies, take the glass vessel containing bridge groom and bride, throw them into the furnace and roast them for 3 days, and they will be two in one flesh. Take the white man from the vessel. One is probably right in assuming that these recipes are instructious for magical sacrifices, not unlike the Greek magic papyri. As an examples of latter, I will give the recipe from the Memuet Papyrus. Take a tomcat and make an Osiris of him by immersing his body in water. And when you proceed to suffocate him, talk into his back. Another example from the same papyrus: take a hopo, tear out its heart, pierce it with a reed, then cut it up and throw it into an Attic honey. Such sacrifices really were made for the purpose of summoning up the Peridoros, the familiar spirit. That the sort of thing was practiced, or at any rate recommended by the alchemist, is clear from the Liber Platonis Quantorum, where it speaks of the oblationis et sacrificia offered to the planetary demon. A deeper and more somber note is struck in the following passage, which I give in the original and generally very corrupt text. I'm not going to read that in that language. I'm going to read it in the language that he has interpreted over here. The vessel must be round in shape. This artifix must be the transformer of this firmament and of the brain pan, just as the thing for which we seek is a simple thing having uniform parts. It is therefore necessary that you should generate it in a body, i.e. a vessel of uniform parts, from the brain pan that is from the head of the element man, and that the whole should be created with urine. One asks oneself how literally this recipe is to be taken. The following story from the Gaya al-Hakim is exceedingly enlightening in this connection. The Jacobite patriarch Dionysius, I said it on the record that in the year 765, a man who was destined for the sacrifice, on beholding the bloody head of his predecessor, was so terrified that he took flight and lodged a complaint with Abbas, the prefect of Mesopotamia, against the priests of Haran, who were afterwards severely punished. The story goes on to say that in 830, the Caliph Mamun told the Haranite envoys, "You are without doubt the people of the head were dealt with by my father, Rashid, will learn from the Gaha that a fair-haired man with dark blue eyes was lured into a chamber of the temple, where he was immersed into a great jar filled with sesame oil. Only his head was left sticking out, where he remained for 40 days, and during this time was fed on nothing but figs soaked in sesame oil. He was not given a drop of water to drink. As a result of this treatment, his body became as soft as wax. The prisoner was repeatedly fumigated with incense. A magical formula was pronounced over him. Eventually his head was torn off at the neck. The body remaining in the oil, that was then placed in a niche of ashes of burnt olives and was packed around with cotton wool. More incense was burned before it, and the head would thereupon predict famines or good harvest, changes of dynasty, and other future events. His eyes could see through the lids, did not move. It also revealed to people their inmost thoughts, and scientific and technical questions were likewise addressed to it. Even though it is possible that the real head was in later times replaced by a dummy, the whole idea of this ceremony, particularly when taken in conjunction with the above passage from Liber Quantarium, seems to point to an original human sacrifice. The idea of a mysterious head is, however, considerably older than the school of Haran. As far back as Zosimos, we find the philosophers described as children of the golden head. And we also encounter the round element, which Zosimos says is the letter omega. This symbol may well be interpreted as the head, since the Liber Quantarium also associates the round vessel with the head. Zosimos, moreover, refers on several occasions to the whitest stone, which is in the head. Probably all of these ideas go back to the severed head of Osiris, which crossed the sea and was therefore associated with the idea of resurrection. The head of Osiris also plays an important part in medieval alchemy. In this connection, we might mention the legend that was current about Gerbert of Reims, afterwards Pope Sylvester II. He was believed to have possessed a golden head, which spoke to him in oracles. Gerbert was one of the greatest savants of his time, and well known as transmitter of Arabic science. Can it be the translation of this Liber Quantarium, which is of Haranite origin, goes back to the author? Unfortunately, there is little prospect of our being able to prove this. It has been conjectured that the Haranite oracle head may be connected with the ancient Hebrew teraphim. Rabbinic traditions consider the teraphim to have been originally either the decapitated head or skull of a human being, or else a dummy head. The Jews had teraphim at the house of sort of lares and penates, who were plural spirits like the the Kabiri. The idea that they were heads goes back to 1 Samuel 19:13, which describes how Michal, David's wife, put the teraphim in David's bed in order to deceive the messengers of Saul who wanted to kill him. Then Michal took an image and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair as its head and covered it with the clothes RSV. The pillow of goat's hair is linguistically obscure and has even been interpreted as meaning that the teraphim were goats, but it may also mean something woven or plaited out of goat's hair like a wig, and this would fit in better with pictures of man lying in bed. Further evidence for this comes from a legend and collection of Mitzrayim, the 12th century, printed in Ben-Gurion's Die Sagen der Juden. There it said the teraphim were idols, and they were made in the following way. The head of a man who had to be firstborn was cut off and the hair plucked out. The head was then sprinkled with salt and anointed with oil. Afterwards, a little plaque of copper or gold was inscribed with the name of an idol and placed under the tongue, the decapitated head. The head was set up in a room, candles were lit before it, and the people made obeisance, and if any man fell down before it, the head began to speak and answered all questions that were addressed to it. This is an obvious parallel to the Hairite ritual within the head. The tearing out of the hair seems significant since it is equivalent of scalping or shearing and is thus a rebirth mystery. It is conceivable that in later times the bald skull was covered with a wig for a rite or renewal, as is also reported from Egypt. It seems probable that this magical procedure is of primitive origin. I am indebted to the South African writer Lawrence van der Post for the following report from a lecture which he gave in Zurich in 1951. The tribe in question was an offshoot of the great Swazi nation, Ubuntu people. When some years ago the older chief died, he was succeeded by his son, a young man of weak character. He soon proved to be so unsatisfactory a chief that his uncles called a meeting of the tribal elders. They decided that something must be done to strengthen their chief, so they consulted the witch doctors. The witch doctors treated him with a medicine which proved ineffective. Another meeting was held. The witch doctors were asked to use the strongest medicine of all on the chief because the situation was becoming desperate. A half-brother of the chief, a boy of 12, was chosen to provide the material for the medicine. One afternoon, a sorcerer went up to the boy who was tending cattle and engaged him in conversation. Then, emptying some powder from a horn to his hand, he took a reed and blew the powder into the ear and nostrils of the boy. The witness told me that the lad thereupon began to sway like a drunken person and sank to the ground shivering. He was then taken to the riverbed and tied to the roots of a tree. More powder was sprinkled about, and the sorcerer saying this person will no longer eat food, but only earth and roots. The boy was kept in the riverbed for 9 months. Some people say a cage was made and put into the stream with the boy inside it for hours on end so that the water should flow over him, make his skin white. Others reported seeing him crawling about in the riverbed on his hands and knees, but all were so frightened that although there was a mission school only 100 yards away, no one except those directly concerned the ritual would go near him. All are agreed that at the end of the 9 months, this fat, normal, healthy boy was like an animal and quite white skin. One woman said his eyes were white and the whole of his body was white as white paper. On the evening that the boy was to be killed, a veteran witch doctor was summoned to the chief's kraal and asked to consult the tribal spirits. This he did in the cattle kraal, and after selecting an animal for slaughter, he retired to the chief's hut. There the witch doctor was handed parts of the dead boy's body, first a head and a sack with a thumb and a toe. He cut off the nose and the ears and lips, mixed them with medicine, and cooked them over a fire in a broken clay pot. He stuck 2 spears on either side of the pot, and then those present 12, all including the weak chief, leaned over the pot and deeply inhaled the steam. All save the boy's mothers dipped their fingers in the pot and licked them. She inhaled but refused to dip her fingers in the pot. The rest of the body the witch doctor mixed into a kind of bread for doctoring the tribe's crops. Although this magical rite is not actually a head mystery, it has several things in common with the practices previously mentioned. The body is macerated and transformed by long immersion in water, and the victim is killed. And the salient portions of the head form the main ingredient of the strengthening medicine, which was concocted for the chief and his immediate circle. The body is kneaded into sort of a bread, and this is obviously thought of a strengthening medicine for the tribe's crops as well. A rite is a transformation process, a sort of rebirth. After 9 months of incubation in the water, Lawrence van der Post thinks that the purpose of the whitening was to assimilate the mana of the white man who has the political power. I agree with this view and would add that paintings with white clay often signifies transformation into ancestral spirits in the same way as neophytes are made invisible in the Nandi territory in Kenya, where they walk about in portable cone-shaped grass huts and demonstrate their invisibility to everyone. Skull worship is widespread among primitives in Melanesia and Polynesia. It is chiefly the skulls of the ancestors that are worshipped because they establish connections with the spirits or serve as tutelary deities like the head of Osiris. In Egypt, skulls also play a considerable role as sacred relics. It would lead us too far to go into this primitive skull worship, so I must refer the reader to the literature. I would only like to point out that the cut off ears, nose, and mouth can represent the head as parts that stand for the whole. There are numerous examples of this. Equally, the head or its parts, brain, etc., can act as magical food or as a means for increasing the fertility of the land. It is of special significance for the alchemical tradition that the oracle head was also known in Greece, Aelian, reports that Cleomenes of Sparta, at the head of his friend Archonides, preserved in a jar of honey, and that he consulted it as an oracle. The same was said. The head of Orpheus, Onians, brightly emphasizes the fact that the whose seat was in the head corresponds to the modern unconscious, that at the stage of development consciousness was identified with breath and lungs and was localized in the chest or the heart region. Hence Pindar's expression for the soul. Image of Eon is extraordinarily apt for the collective unconscious. Not only imparts oracles, but forever represents the microcosm, i.e. the form of physical man mirroring the cosmos. There is no evidence to show that any of the parallels we have drawn here are historically connected with Zosimos visions. It seems rather to be a case, partly or parallel traditions, transmitted perhaps chiefly through the Huron school, and partly as spontaneous fantasies arising from the same archetypical background from which the traditions were derived in the first place. As my examples have shown, the imagery of the Zosimos visions, however strange it may be, is by no means isolated, but is interwoven with older ideas, some of which were certainly and others quite possibly known as Zosimos, as well as with parallels of uncertainty, which continued to mold the speculation of the alchemist for many centuries to come. Religious thought in all early Christian era was not completely cut off from all contact with those conceptions. It was in fact influenced by them, and in turn it fertilized the minds of the natural philosophers during later centuries. Towards the end of the 16th century, the alchemical opus was even represented in the form of a mass. The author of this tour de force was a Hungarian alchemist, Nicolor Sibinus. I have elaborated this parallel in my book, Psychology and Alchemy. In the visions of Zosimos, the Hierus was transformed into Numia, represents the transformative principle at work in nature and harmony of opposing forces. Chinese philosophy formulated this process as in a diatromian interplay of yin and yang, but the curious personifications and symbols characteristic not only of these visions, but of alchemical literature in general, show in the plainest possible terms that we are dealing with psychic process that takes place mainly in the unconscious and therefore can come into consciousness only in the form of a dream or vision. At that time, and until very much later, no one had any idea of the unconsciousness. Consequently, all unconscious contents were projected into the object, or rather were found in nature as apparent objects or properties of matter, and were not recognized as purely internal psychic events. There is some evidence that Zosimos was well aware of the spiritual or mystical side of his art, but he believed that what he was concerned with was a spirit that dwelt in natural objects and not something that came from the human psyche. It remained for modern science to despiritualize nature through its so-called objective knowledge of matter. All anthropomorphic projections were withdrawn from the object, one after another, with a twofold result. Firstly, man's mystical identity with nature was curtailed as never before, and secondly, the projections falling back into the human soul caused such a terrific activation of the unconscious that in modern times man was compelled to postulate the existence of an unconscious psyche. The first beginnings of this can be seen in Leibniz and Kant, and then with the mounting intensity in Schilling, Keres, and von Hartmann, until finally modern psychology discarded the last metaphysical claims of the philosopher-psychologist and restricted the idea of the psyche's existence to the psychological statement, and other words to its phenomenology. So far as the dramatic course of the Mass represents the death, sacrifice, and the resurrection of a God, and the inclusion and active participation of the priest and congregation, its phenomenology may legitimately be brought into line with other fundamentally similar, though more primitive, religious customs. This always involves the risk that sensitive people will find it unpleasant when small things are compared with great. In fairness to the primitive psyche, however, I would like to emphasize that the holy dread of civilized man differs but little from the awe of primitive, and that the God who is present and active in the mystery is a mystery for both, no matter how crass the outward differences. The similarity or equivalence of meanings should not be overlooked.